and a Methodist church. So the Methodist Church, of course, now is the United Church, and that's what it looks like today. And there's some of the detail that I think makes it interesting. Dr. Arunyadeka was born 10th of August, 1841, on the Six Nations Reserve near Brantford. He studied at Oxford and graduated from the University of Toronto as a medical doctor in 1866. He married Ellen Hill, a granddaughter of Chief Deseronto. Arunyadeka practiced medicine at Frankfurt, Stratford, Napanee, Buffalo, New York, and London. He joined the Independent Order of Foresters despite its racial exclusions and became its first Supreme Chief Ranger. The Independent Order of Foresters is a mutual benefit society that still exists, although it's gone through a number of amalgamations. It and similar organizations were originally founded as a way for ordinary working people to obtain life insurance. Arunyadeka also belonged to the International Order of Good Templars, several branches of the Masonic Order, the Ancient Order of United Workmen, the Knights of the Maccabees, and the Orange Order. In the 1890s, he purchased an island across from Deseronto, which he renamed Forester's Island. Here he built a second family home, an IOF meeting hall, a bandstand, a hotel, and cottages for guests, and a wharf at which boats from the mainland could dock. While the hotel seems to have been open for all guests, not just IOF members, he hosted huge IOF gatherings each summer to celebrate its anniversaries. And these are not rustic cottages. These are elegant homes. You look at the inside furnishings, very elaborate. The roof over there says Forester's Island Park. Ironically, the one achievement of which Arunyadeka was most proud was the enterprise his contemporaries regarded as his only significant failure. In 1904, he created an orphanage on the Bay of Quinte. It opened for operations in 1906, and Arunyadeka described it as his life's crowning achievement. He did not live to see it sold in 1908, as he died in 1907, the year following its opening. After laying in state at Massey Hall in Toronto, he was transferred to Deseronto and was buried in the churchyard of Christ Church, His Majesty's Royal Chapel, on the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. So now, Bayview Ranch, the basics for the Fingland farm. So the ranch was bought, first of all, to ensure a steady supply of horses. You're doing all these logging operations in the north. You need horsepower to move those heavy logs. So they started Bayview Ranch to raise the horses. But it also did other things. It raised prize cattle, experimented with other types of crops. There were Rathbun gardens on the east side of the boundary road for fresh vegetables. And my personal interest in the Rathbun story lies with Bayview Ranch. My father-in-law, Hugh John Fingland, moved to Bayview Ranch in 1938, and my husband grew up there. When they arrived, the large brick home visible in the photo had years ago burned, and they lived in what had been the hired help's duplex home to the right of the image. A lot of the trees along the lane had been cut down during the First World War, when there was two pilot training centers in the area. So this is actually the one that was west of town, as opposed to the one that was on the Rathbun property. What I wanted to know was why Hugh's father, Adam, held the mortgage on a farm in the second concession south of the Slash Road, what's referred to as the broken front of Tyendinaga Township, when he lived on the 8th concession of Camden. My brother-in-law Don told me that the previous owner had been Fred Perry and his son Hugh. Adam had held mortgages on a significant number of properties since he invested in land rather than building an addition on his own house or buying his wife fancy dishes. No frivolity for him. So, how did he know Fred Perry? When Adam died January the 7th, 1937, he left 2 sons and 3 daughters, as well as his widow. He had a substantial estate, but it was all tied up in mortgages, many of which were in serious default. The daughters needed to have their share of the estate paid out. Hugh and his young family lived on a farm across the road from the home farm, where his younger brother George and his mother lived. They were able to sell Hugh's farm and foreclosed on the one in Tyne-Tenaga. As I continued my research, I came across others who'd moved to Deseronto or to Tyne-Tenaga Township from Camden. As I noted already, Adam's brother George lived in Deseronto, and there were several Wilson and Hinchey cousins who lived in the area. I found Fred Perry on the 1901 census living next door to a second cousin of Adam's, Fanny Wilson, who was married to Thomas Close in North Fredericksburg, Lennox and Addington. Was that the connection? On the 1911 census, Fred Perry shows as dealing in real estate and lives in Napanee. There were other connections between Perrys and Wilsons, with 2 of his Wilson cousins married to Perry men. Finally, I found my answer when I located Fred Perry's Ontario death registration. On page 171 of the 1929 deaths in the county of Lennox and Addington, division of Napanee, I found Perry Frederick Albert, aged 63 years, 2 days, merchant of flour and feed, who died October the 10th, 1929, from suicide by hanging, owing to temporary insanity over family business worries. Not often does one see so much information in the cause of death. Of course Adam knew Fred Perry. He would have likely dealt with him routinely as a flour and feed merchant in Napanee, the Lennox and Addington County seat. I had thought that Fred Perry was a farmer, and I'd been frustrated when I was unable to find him on the 1921 census because the names were cut off when the census was originally filmed. If anybody's looking for their relatives on the 1921 census here, you're going to have a hard time. His son Hugh may have been living on the farm, but knowing that he was a businessman, he speculated in real estate. He hung himself in 1929, or now 1937. The mortgage has presumably been in default all those years. Okay, it now makes sense. And we all know what happened October 1929, right? Fred Perry had actually committed suicide 19 days before the infamous Black Friday stock market crash, but it's probable there were already ripples of impending disaster. Back to the Rathbun Company and the town. So what changed? They had fires, really bad. Disastrous fires occurred in 1872, 1892, again in 1896, and then in 1906. But until 1906, they always recovered. The big change? Edward Wilkes Rathbun died the 24th of November, 1903. Born the 5th of October, 1842, he was only 61 and was in the process of continuing to diversify the business away from lumber. Frederick Sherwood Rathbun, he'd already died in 1898, Herbert in 1897, and William in 1896. They were all gone, the whole generation. And key employees who weren't family members also died, and the company lost their expertise. For example, the Toronto Daily Star notes the passing of one Mr. R.C. Carter on August 22, 1904, at age 60. Mr. Carter had been a director of the Canadian Portland Cement Company and the Rathbun Company, general manager of the Bay of Quinte Railway, the Thousand Islands Railway, and the Deseronto Navigation Company. He'd suffered a stroke 2 weeks previously while on a train between Deseronto and Montreal. And the eldest son who inherited, he had other interests. He was not interested in the company. So the next generation, because this one's gone. And some of these men have died at 31 years of age. Who would have expected that? There's the blast furnace in 1908 after the fire. It's a pretty big mess, admittedly. So the next generation, Edward Wilkes Rathbun and Elizabeth Howbird had 3 children. There was Frances Mary, born 1870. Frances married a man by the name of Cornelius Arthur Maston in 1894 in Montreal. And he was a Toronto lawyer who eventually became an appeal court judge. Edward Walter, who's the oldest son, born 1865, and he inherited his father's business empire, but not his spirit. He married Eileen May Blair, who had been born to Captain James Jenkins Blair of the British Army, and his wife, Emma Catherine Charlotte Arthur, on the 20th of August, 1868, in Nazirabad, Bombay, India. Edward Walter was a member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament from the 25th of January, 1905 to the 2nd of May, 1908, representing Hastings East. He liked politics. And he was employed by the Bank of Montreal most of his life, in London, England, and in Italy. They had a third child, George Benedict, who died prior to 1871. So with his second wife, Benella McMurrick, Edward Wilkes Rathbun had 5 children who survived infancy. Harold, born 1877, Benella, born 1880, Lawrence Marvin, born 1884, Adrian Storm, born 1887, and Marjorie, born 1891. So here's a photo of these young people enjoying a good time. The man in the front is Adrian Storm. The girl beside him is Jean Maston, and she's the daughter of his eldest half-sister. Here's Marjorie, the baby of the family. And this is Benella, who was usually called Pansy to differentiate her from her mother, and she's holding her eldest daughter, Barbara. These were probably taken about 1907. And I think they were already living in England at the time and had come home for a family visit. So here's a copy of the 1911 census. So this is an image from Find My Past. And what happened with that census, it's really good. The householders filled it in themselves. So we're looking at what they wrote down. So instead of having an anonymous census taker who doesn't know how to spell your name come and make a mess of it, the people filled these forms in. So Benella, we have their 3 daughters, and then his mother-in-law, Benella Rathbun, is there as a widow visiting, and so is Marjorie. And then we have the 4 servants: the nursemaid, the cook, the parlor maid, and the housemaid. They're doing quite well, I think. So I was going to tell you a little bit, before we got into World War I, a little bit about Barbara, who's that daughter that Benella was holding on her hip. She marries in 1935, and here's what was in the New York Evening Post. The marriage yesterday afternoon of Miss Barbara Franklin Jones to Mr. William Angevin Eldridge also comes as a surprise to all but close friends and relatives of the young couple, no announcement having been made of their engagement. The Reverend Mr. A.R. McKechnie of Great Neck, Long Island, read the service, which took place at 25 East 86th Street, the town residence of the bride's parents. Mr. and Mrs. H.V. Franklin Jones. The bride, who was unattended, wore a veil of Brussels lace over her princess gown of ivory satin, and her flowers were orchids and lilies of the valley. The couple is sailing for a honeymoon abroad, and upon their return, they'll be at home at 414 East 52nd Street. Miss Jones's father is a member of the stock exchange firm of Walker Brothers. Mr. Eldridge, who's a son of Mr. Lewis A. Eldridge of Saddle Rock, Long Island, prepared for college at Phillips Exeter and was graduated from Harvard in 1921. On the 1940 census, Henry and Benella have now moved to 1178 Madison Avenue. He's a stockbroker. Toronto. It was published in 1923, and it describes the military careers of two of Edward Wilkes Rathbun's sons and one of his nephews. So, that's actually the next little thing. We've got Walter, who's that eldest son. In 1923, he's living in Casa Belvedere, Alassio, Italy. He entered Upper Canada College in 1879 from a tutor. He graduated in 80. He was the son of Edward Wilkes Rathbun, yes. He graduated from Queen's University. He was promoted to the Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th and 8th Battery Field Artillery, President of the Dominion Artillery Association, the Canadian Military Association, 6th Brigade Canadian Forces Artillery, Lieutenant Colonel. He went overseas spring of 1915, and he was named the commandant of Shorncliffe Camp in France in 1916. He fancied himself quite the military man. Then we have Adrian Storm Rathbun, one of the youngest sons. In 1923, he's an industrial surveyor in Vancouver. He entered Upper Canada College from a private school in Port Hope. Went on to McGill University. Then he worked for the CNR and for the Southern Pacific Railway in San Francisco. He enlisted in 1917. He went to France October 1918. Not much war left, is there? So he was discharged in June of 1919. Then we've got Hugo Burghardt, who's not one of Edward Wilkes Rathbun's sons, but a... This Hugo Burghardt Rathbun, named for his grandfather, was the son of Herbert Rathbun, who died in 1897, and his wife Agnes Bell. Hugo attended Upper Canada College for brief periods of time, but he got most of his education at the Belleville Public School and the Belleville High School. He started at the University of Toronto in medicine, but he didn't graduate. So he joins up October the 15th, 1915, and he goes with the 9th Brigade Armored Column. So he goes overseas June 22nd, 1916. He fought at Vimy Ridge, Hill 70, Fresnoy, Passchendaele in 1917. He was gas and shell-shocked May, Arras, Amiens, 1918. Gassed June and November. He returned from overseas in 1919. He took the brunt of it. So then we go to the McGill Honor Roll, because some of them went there. So there was Adrian Storm that we'd already met. He served in France briefly. We have Lawrence Marvin Rathbun. He attested for World War I in August of 1915, and he describes himself as a gentleman. And Lawrence his name, appears on a passenger declaration form returning to Canada from military service, he claims his occupation as lumber agent. Adrian's in Vancouver in 1922 working as a salesman when he marries Robina Elizabeth Morrison, who lists her occupation as Soldiers Civil Reestablishment. Makes sense, he'd meet her. And thinking about World War I's a good time to mention local author Frances Satani and her 2 novels about Deseronto. And I understand that Frances is going to be speaking next month. Wrong button. So,
Walter inherited the company, but unlike his father, who poured himself into the business, he lived and worked abroad, with many appearances on passenger lists, including a departure from Southampton in 1936, traveling to Genoa.
and here's a return to Canada, 17th of August 1940. So almost a full year after World War II has started, before he comes back to Canada. The Rathbun Company was liquidated in 1923, 40 years after its incorporation. There was fire. Retreating forests made raw materials harder to acquire. Once you cut down the tree, it's down. World War I, and a generation who'd been given all the good things in life and who found other ways to make money. Among Edward Wilkes' descendants and their spouses, we have several stockbrokers and bank managers. Like any business or family, they were in business to make money. Only rarely does someone choose to make the growth of a community a focus for their business efforts. The Rathbuns did not go bankrupt. They just changed their focus. They continued to be mentioned in the newspapers, both in New York and in Toronto. For example, William Cullum's son, Arthur Bryan Rathbun, is noted on the society pages of the Toronto Daily Star when he marries Frances Muriel Cotton, daughter of Mrs. Weston Brock, in 1919. There's a lengthy description of the wedding. They're members of the yacht club. And what about Frederick Sherwood's family? He's got 2 sons and 2 daughters that were born in Deseronto. But the younger son dies at 37. And he was an accountant. That's all very nice, but he's gone. The daughter married Fred Gamble Bingham, and he was a manufacturer, but I'm sure he found somebody else to work for. So what then for Deseronto?
Initially, the town faltered, with house prices plummeting, but eventually new industries came in to fill the void. There was a radio factory. There were 2 canning factories, a trucking company to ship the canned goods to market, a shipyard, a marina, and a marine salvage operation called Dravo, Ford and General Motors dealerships, several garages, a factory that made eyeglass frames, the Eddie Match Company. The grocery stores and butchers still fed the townspeople.
And there were shoe stores and banks, a bowling alley, and the theater remained. There's Mally's drugstore, about 1930. So I'm told the telephone switchboard was in the back and Mally produced the phone book. Here's the Circle 6 Orchestra performing in 1927. So they were popular. They were all Deseronto boys. So from left to right, we have Reg Dawson, Roy Woodcock, Clayton John, James McVicker, who I believe became the doctor, Marshall Woodcock, and Roy Kitchen. June 18th night, there's a program from Naylor's Theatre. Here's an example of the Toronto Daily Star covering the 145th United Empire Loyalist celebrations in town. So this is a 1941 directory, and I want to draw your attention to an error and an example of why you should never trust a single source. In this directory, and I've blown this part up, we have Fingland George. Just a second. That George Fingland, he died in Deseronto the 16th of May, 1938. I have his death registration. And Hugh and his family moved here about the same time that George died. So there's George, who's dead. Where's Hugh? You can't count on it. It's one piece of information and it doesn't make it right. So
Harold, the eldest son of Edward Wilkes Rathbun's second family, appears on the 1911 census in Deseronto with his mother and his sister Marjorie. His occupation is manufacturer. In 1921, he's still with his mother and sister in Deseronto, but gives his occupation as lumber. He lived part of his life in Toronto, sharing a home with his mother Benella and his brother Lawrence Marvin at 137 Farnham Street, according to the voters list of 1935. On that voters list, Lawrence Marvin shows as a broker and Harold as retired.
By the time we come, this is from the 1935 voters list. And they're a great way to fill in years in between census. They don't tell you relationships, but at least they give you an address and a place. So by the time of the 1940 voters list, they were all living in Deseronto. Harold had a small hobby farm on the block of land on St. George Street, across from the Presbyterian Church and Nora Stoddard's home. There's the lane going back to the farm. But this was still unoccupied, and he had a hobby farm there. So Nora was a good friend of Audrey Fingland's, and she'd walk up the lane for tea, and then Harold would come up and stand and talk to Hugh about